The chair scraped violently against the floor. The man by the window stood up too fast, eyes wide, breath broken, his hand tightening around the worn bag at his feet. Someone gasped. Someone stepped back. Fear spread faster than truth. "That dog is dangerous," a voice shouted. In that moment, one wrong move could have turned a quiet cafe into chaos. But the dog did not attack. He stepped forward once, calm and controlled, placing his body between fear and misunderstanding. The room froze. No growl, no bark, just silence. And then a quiet voice cut through it all. "Everyone breathe. Nothing is about to happen." That was the moment everything changed. Not because of force, but because someone chose control over violence. Morning arrived in Bozeman, Montana, the way it often did in early spring. Slow, pale, and honest. A thin veil of fog clung to the edges of the streets, softening the outlines of brick buildings and lampposts as if the town itself were reluctant to fully wake. The air was cold but clean, carrying the scent of pine from the nearby hills and the faint promise of warmth later in the day. People moved gently through the morning, wrapped in jackets and routines, unaware that this ordinary hour was about to test something far more fragile than peace. Ethan Cole stepped onto the sidewalk with the quiet certainty of a man who had learned long ago how to enter a place without disturbing it. He was 42 years old, tall without trying to be imposing, broad-shouldered in a way that came not from the gym but from years of carrying weight that mattered. His hair was dark brown, cut short and already threaded with gray at the temples, and his face bore the subtle lines of someone who had squinted into distant horizons more often than into mirrors. He wore a faded olive jacket over a plain gray shirt, dark jeans worn soft at the knees, and leather boots whose scuffed toes told stories he never volunteered. Ethan had once been a Navy SEAL, though nothing about him now demanded recognition for it. He did not walk like a hero. He walked like someone who preferred not to be noticed. At his left side moved Rex. Rex was a German shepherd, 8 years old, his coat a disciplined blend of black and deep tan, his body lean and powerful without excess. His ears stood alert, not from excitement, but from habit, and his amber-brown eyes carried a calm intelligence that made people uncomfortable if they held his gaze too long. Time had left its mark on him as well, a faint scar near one ear, a stiffness in his back legs when the weather turned cold. But none of it dulled his presence. Rex was not a pet. He was a partner. He walked close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth of him through the fabric of his jacket, matching pace without a word, without a command. They reached a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a hardware shop, its windows fogged from the warmth inside. The sign above the door was modest, hand-painted, the kind of place locals trusted because it never tried to impress anyone. Ethan opened the door, holding it just long enough for Rex to pass through first. A small bell chimed overhead, then settled back into silence. Inside, the cafe was alive with quiet routines. The low hum of conversation blended with the hiss of the espresso machine. Cups clinked. A radio murmured softly from somewhere behind the counter, playing a song no one was actively listening to. The smell of coffee wrapped itself around the room, rich and grounding. Several people glanced at Rex as they entered. Most looked away quickly, unsure. One woman near the window smiled faintly, then returned to her book. No one said anything. Ethan stepped up to the counter. Behind it stood a young woman named Lily, though her name tag was partially obscured by the strap of her apron. She was in her mid-20s, slim, with light brown hair pulled into a messy bun that spoke of early mornings and little patience for vanity. Her face was open, but her eyes carried the mild fatigue of someone who had already dealt with 3 complaints before sunrise. She greeted Ethan with polite efficiency, not unkind, but distant. "Black coffee," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. Lily nodded, already reaching for a cup. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Rex, then away. She hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but said nothing. For now. Ethan paid, moved toward a small table near the wall, and sat. Rex lowered himself beside Ethan's chair, positioning his body so that it faced the room rather than the wall, his back straight, his head level. To an untrained eye, he looked relaxed. To Ethan, he looked ready. For a moment, everything felt ordinary. Ethan wrapped his hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into his fingers. He listened without listening, letting the sounds of the café blur together. This was what peace looked like, he reminded himself. Small, quiet, earned. Then Rex paused. It was subtle, so subtle that no one else noticed. His ears shifted forward by a degree almost too small to measure. His breathing changed, slower but deeper. His gaze locked onto something across the room. Ethan followed Rex's line of sight. Near the front window sat a man alone, perhaps in his late 30s or early 40s. He was average in height and build, his brown hair unkempt as if he had run his hands through it too many times without realizing it. He wore a faded denim jacket over a hooded sweatshirt, the hood bunched awkwardly at his neck. His posture was closed, shoulders rounded inward, as though he were trying to make himself smaller. One hand rested on his knee, bouncing slightly, while the other clutched the edge of the table with unnecessary force. His name was Michael Turner, though no one in the café knew it. He had once been a Marine, years ago, a fact that now lived quietly inside him like an old wound that never fully healed. Civilian life had not been cruel to him, but it had been loud, unpredictable, and unforgiving in ways that training never prepared him for. Crowded spaces tightened his chest. Raised voices made his pulse race. He had come to the café because he needed somewhere warm, somewhere normal, somewhere he could pretend to be like everyone else. Rex saw what others could not. He saw the shallow breathing, the tension in Michael's jaw, the scent of adrenaline beginning to rise as Michael became aware, too aware, of the room around him. Rex had been trained in places where such signs came seconds before chaos, and training did not fade simply because the war was over. Rex did not bark. He did not growl. He leaned forward slightly, placing himself more squarely between Ethan and the rest of the café. Ethan felt it immediately. He did not look at Rex. He did not need to. He simply lowered 2 fingers and rested them lightly against Rex's collar, a touch that carried years of shared understanding. It was not a command. It was reassurance. "I see it too," the touch said. Rex held his position. Across the room, Michael shifted in his chair, unaware of why his skin felt suddenly too tight. He glanced around, his eyes landing briefly on Rex. For a second, fear flashed across his face, not of the dog, but of being seen too clearly. The café continued on, blissfully ignorant of the thin thread tightening beneath its calm. Coffee was poured, a chair scraped, someone laughed too loudly. The morning remained quiet, but it was no longer empty. The moment did not announce itself with noise, only with a shift in tone that seasoned people recognized before words caught up. Ethan had just lifted his cup when the young woman behind the counter straightened, her posture tightening as if she had reached a decision she did not particularly enjoy making. Her name was Sarah Whitman, a shift supervisor in her early 30s, tall and slender, with ash-blonde hair cut to her shoulders and pulled back with practical restraint. Years of managing customers had taught her efficiency over warmth, and a recent incident involving an aggressive customer had left her wary of anything she could not immediately categorize. She was not unkind by nature, but caution had slowly edged out curiosity in her daily judgments. She stepped away from the espresso machine and approached Ethan's table with a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her gaze dropped to Rex first, lingering longer than courtesy required. "Sir," she said, her voice firm but pitched a little higher than normal, "we don't allow dogs inside the café." The room quieted in subtle ways, conversation softening, chairs shifting as people leaned just enough to listen without appearing to do so. Ethan looked up at her slowly, not startled, not defensive. "He's a service dog," he replied, his tone even, almost gentle. He did not raise his voice, did not gesture, did not offer explanation beyond the truth itself. Sarah's smile tightened. "I understand," she said, though it was clear she did not. "But we usually require visible identification. A vest or paperwork." Her eyes flicked again to Rex, measuring him against some internal checklist. Rex remained still, posture controlled, eyes forward, his presence disciplined enough to look almost carved into place. A murmur rippled through the café, the soft rustle of judgment forming in whispers and glances. A middle-aged man near the counter snorted quietly, folding his newspaper with unnecessary force. A young couple paused their conversation, the woman's brow furrowing as she watched. Near the window, Michael shifted in his chair, the tension in his shoulders tightening another degree as the attention in the room subtly redirected toward the exchange. Ethan set his cup down carefully, the ceramic making a muted sound against the table. "He doesn't need a vest," he said, "and I don't carry paperwork for him." There was no challenge in his voice, only certainty. Sarah exhaled through her nose, impatience creeping into her expression. "Sir, I'm responsible for everyone in here," she said, her tone sharpening. "If someone feels uncomfortable, I have to address it." The word uncomfortable hung in the air like a thin accusation. Rex's ears flicked once, then stilled. His attention remained on Michael, but his awareness widened, tracking the emotional temperature of the room the way he had been trained to do years ago. He did not move, but the energy around him changed, contained and watchful. From a nearby table, an older woman named Carol Bennett looked up from her book. She was in her late 60s, petite, with silver hair cut neatly above her collar, her face lined softly by years of laughter and loss in equal measure. Carol had lost her husband a decade earlier, a quiet man who had served in the army and returned with a silence that never fully left him. She recognized something familiar in Rex's stillness, something she had seen once before in a different kind of uniform. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then hesitated, uncertain whether her voice would help or complicate what was unfolding. Michael's breathing grew shallow. He could feel eyes on him now, though no one was looking directly. The tension in the room pressed against his chest, a weight he had learned to endure but never quite master. He kept his gaze fixed on the table, fingers curling and uncurling as if trying to ground himself in the grain of the wood. The presence of the dog both steadied and unsettled him, stirring memories he preferred to keep buried. Sarah noticed none of this. Her focus had narrowed to procedure, to the perceived challenge of authority in her workplace. "I'm going to have to ask you to take the dog outside," she said, her voice louder now, the edge unmistakable. "Or I'll need to involve management." Ethan studied her for a moment, really looked at her, seeing not an adversary, but a woman tired of making judgment calls that never came with enough information. "I'm not trying to make your morning harder," he said quietly. "And neither is he." He rested his hand briefly on Rex's shoulder, a gesture so subtle it could have been mistaken for nothing at all. The murmurs grew. Someone coughed. A chair scraped back as a man stood, stretching as if disengaging himself from the situation entirely. The café felt smaller, its walls closer, the air thicker with unspoken opinions. Sarah crossed her arms, a defensive habit she had picked up after too many confrontations. "Rules are rules," she said, "and without proof, I can't make exceptions." Rex shifted then, just slightly, adjusting his position so that his body angled more toward the center of the room. It was not a challenge, not a threat, but it was movement, and movement drew attention. Several heads turned at once. Michael flinched, his foot knocking softly against the leg of the table. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Ethan felt the moment tipping. He did not intervene further, did not escalate, did not argue. He simply remained where he was, grounded, present, allowing the weight of the situation to reveal itself without force. Years of experience had taught him that pressure often resolved itself when not pushed back against. Sarah noticed the movement and misread it. "See," she said, gesturing toward Rex. "That's exactly what I mean. He's making people nervous." Carol closed her book with a decisive motion and stood. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm but firm, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had lived long enough to know when silence did more harm than good. "That dog hasn't done anything wrong," she said. "He's better behaved than half the people in here." A few nods followed. Not many, but enough to shift the balance. Sarah looked startled, her certainty wavering as she realized the room was no longer entirely on her side. Michael swallowed hard, his pulse loud in his ears. The attention felt unbearable now, his thoughts beginning to scatter. Rex's eyes flicked to him, steady, unwavering, a silent anchor in the rising tide of emotion. Ethan met Sarah's gaze again. "I'm not asking for special treatment," he said. "Just respect?" His words were simple, unadorned, carrying the weight of someone who understood how quickly misunderstanding could turn into something worse. The café fell quiet, the earlier warmth replaced by a tense stillness. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, sunlight pressing faintly against the windows, unaware of the fragile balance inside. The morning was no longer merely quiet. It was watchful, waiting to see which way the moment would break. Rex did not move because of noise. He did not react to the scrape of chairs, the tightening silence, or the weight of curious eyes. Those were distractions, surface ripples. What reached him came from deeper places, places he had learned to read long before cafes and quiet mornings became part of his world. It was the change in the man by the window, the way Michael's breathing shortened and lost rhythm, the way his shoulders rose as if bracing for impact that never came, the way the smell of adrenaline thickened in the air around him like an approaching storm. Rex's training had never been about aggression. It had been about thresholds. He had been taught to recognize the precise moment when tension tipped from manageable to dangerous, when a human mind slipped from control into instinct. In another life, those moments had preceded gunfire, shouting, sudden movement that left no time for thought. Here, in a cafe filled with warm light and ordinary people, the pattern was the same, only the setting had changed. Michael's hands trembled more openly now. He pressed them flat against the table, then pulled them back as if the surface were too hot. His eyes darted briefly toward the counter, then to the door, measuring distances, exits, possibilities. He was not planning harm. He was preparing for escape, a reflex shaped by years of training, followed by years of unlearning that never quite worked. Civilian spaces did this to him, especially when attention turned sharp and judgment crept in. He had told himself he could handle a cup of coffee, that he deserved something normal. Now the room felt hostile, unpredictable, full of rules he did not understand anymore. Rex saw it all in fragments of posture and scent. He rose slowly from his resting position, not suddenly, not dramatically. His movement was deliberate, almost gentle, as he stepped half a pace forward and angled his body so that he stood between Ethan and the shifting center of the room. His head remained level, eyes steady, tail low and still. It was a protective stance, one designed to create space rather than close it. Ethan noticed immediately. He did not look surprised. He had lived with Rex long enough to trust the dog's instincts without question. Where others might see a dog standing up, Ethan saw a warning that did not yet require words. He adjusted his posture slightly, feet planted more firmly on the floor, shoulders relaxed but ready. He did not speak. Sometimes silence carried more authority than explanation. Across the room, Sarah noticed Rex's movement and felt a flash of vindication. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the stress of responsibility she carried every shift. She had been promoted after a customer had thrown a chair during a confrontation months earlier, an incident that ended with police lights and shaken employees. Since then, she had promised herself she would never hesitate again, never ignore what might become a problem. Rex's movement, controlled as it was, fit too easily into her memory of chaos. "See," she said to no one in particular, her voice tight. "That's what I'm talking about." She took a step back, creating distance, unaware that her own retreat was feeding the tension she feared. Carol watched the exchange with a quiet ache in her chest. She recognized the look on Michael's face now, the way his eyes seemed both distant and too present at the same time. She had seen that look on her husband years ago, after he came home from his second deployment, and could no longer sit with his back to a door. She had learned then that fear often wore the mask of anger, and that pushing someone in that state rarely ended well. She clasped her hands together, willing herself not to speak too soon, not to add another voice to the rising noise. Michael's foot tapped faster against the floor. The sound felt unbearably loud to him, each tap a reminder that he was being watched, judged, measured. He became acutely aware of Rex's position, the dog's calm gaze fixed on him without accusation. It unsettled him at first, then grounded him. There was no threat in those eyes, only attention. It was the same look he had seen from dogs on base years ago, the ones trained to watch for danger without becoming it. Rex did not advance further. He held his ground, creating a quiet boundary. His presence changed the shape of the room, redirecting attention away from scattered judgments and toward a single point of calm control. It was a skill honed through repetition and trust, through countless moments where restraint mattered more than force. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear. "Easy," he murmured, not as an order, but as reassurance. The word was meant for Rex, for Michael, for the room itself. He kept his hands visible, resting loosely at his sides, his posture open. There was no challenge in him, no impatience. He was waiting, giving the moment space to settle. Michael swallowed hard. His gaze flicked from Rex to Ethan, lingering there longer this time. There was something familiar in Ethan's stillness, something that cut through the noise in his head. He recognized it before he understood it, the presence of someone who knew what it meant to stand on the edge of losing control and choose not to. His breathing slowed, just a fraction, enough to matter. The café seemed to hold its breath. Conversations had stopped entirely now, replaced by the kind of silence that made every small movement feel amplified. A spoon clinked against a cup somewhere near the counter, the sound sharp and out of place. Outside, a truck passed, tires hissing against damp pavement, a reminder that the world beyond the windows continued on, indifferent. Rex shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance to remain directly between Ethan and Michael, without appearing to confront either. It was a subtle dance of positioning, one he had learned through countless repetitions. He was not guarding against attack. He was guarding against misunderstanding, against the chain reaction that began when fear met fear and neither knew how to stop. Sarah's certainty faltered as she watched. The dog was not acting the way she had expected. There was no lunging, no baring of teeth, no escalation. Instead, there was restraint so complete it felt intentional. Confusion crept into her expression, followed by a flicker of doubt. She wondered briefly if she had misread the situation, if her own fear had filled in gaps where understanding should have been. Michael's hand stopped shaking. He drew in a long breath through his nose, then let it out slowly, counting without realizing it. The tightness in his chest eased enough for him to sit back in his chair. His eyes never left Rex, but the fear there softened into something closer to recognition. Ethan felt the shift and did not press it. He knew better than to rush relief. He stayed where he was, grounded and present, allowing the fragile balance to hold. Rex remained standing, alert but calm, a living testament to the difference between readiness and aggression. The moment did not end with applause or resolution. It simply settled, like dust after a sudden movement. The threat that had never truly existed receded, replaced by a quiet awareness of how close the room had come to something worse. The morning light grew stronger against the windows, the fog outside lifting enough to reveal the street beyond. The café was still tense, but the edge had dulled. Rex remained between Ethan and the rest of the room, not because he expected danger, but because his instincts told him to hold the line a little longer. This was what he had been trained to do, not to fight, but to protect, by presence alone. The silence that followed Rex's calm stance did not last long. Silence rarely survived fear once words were given permission to enter. It broke with a voice sharp enough to cut through restraint, a voice that carried irritation disguised as confidence. The man who spoke was named Thomas Reed, though most people called him Tom. He was in his mid-50s, broad through the chest, with thinning gray hair, combed carefully to one side, and a permanent crease between his eyebrows, from years of believing the world owed him clarity. Tom had never served in the military, but he had grown up around men who talked about strength as volume and authority as dominance. He wore a heavy flannel shirt, stretched tight over his stomach, and smelled faintly of cigarettes and impatience. "This is ridiculous," Tom said, pushing his chair back slightly. "That dog looks dangerous. You can't seriously tell me that thing belongs in a place like this." The word "thing" landed with weight, not loud but deliberate. A few people flinched, others nodded without realizing they were doing it. Fear often borrowed courage from the loudest voice in the room. Rex did not react to Tom directly. His ears did not flick. His posture did not change. But the energy in the room shifted, tightening like a wire pulled too far. Ethan felt it immediately, the subtle rise of tension that had nothing to do with the dog and everything to do with how quickly people chose sides when given permission. Sarah turned toward Tom, relief flickering across her face. Someone else had said it now. The responsibility no longer sat solely on her shoulders. "That's exactly my concern," she said, her voice louder than before, sharpened by validation. "We can't take risks like this." Michael heard the word dangerous, and something inside him snapped loose. His breath caught hard in his chest, shallow and fast, each inhale scraping like it had to fight its way in. The room blurred at the edges. Sound sharpened. He became acutely aware of every movement, every shift of weight, every possible threat. His hand tightened around the strap of the worn canvas bag at his feet, not because he meant to use it, but because it anchored him to something familiar. Rex noticed the change instantly. The scent in the air spiked, adrenaline surging sharp and unmistakable. Michael's posture collapsed inward and then surged outward in a single, uncontrolled motion. The chair legs screeched against the floor as Michael stood up abruptly, too fast, too stiff, his eyes wide and unfocused. Gasps rippled through the café. Tom took an instinctive step back. Someone near the counter muttered a curse. A woman clutched her cup with both hands as if it might protect her. In the span of a second, uncertainty transformed into assumption. Fear filled the gaps where understanding had failed. Michael did not see any of them. He saw exits. He saw distance. He saw a room that had turned hostile without warning. His heart hammered so loudly it drowned out reason. His shoulders were hunched, his stance uneven, every muscle caught between flight and collapse. Rex moved. He stepped forward with measured control, placing himself directly between Ethan and Michael, his body angled, not toward attack, but toward containment. His head stayed level, eyes steady, his presence firm and unmistakable. He did not bare his teeth. He did not make a sound. He simply claimed space, drawing attention away from Michael and onto himself. To the untrained eye, it looked like escalation. To Ethan, it was prevention. "Hey," Tom barked, pointing. "You see that? That dog's about to go for him." The accusation snapped through the room like dry wood breaking. Sarah's breath hitched. Her instincts screamed liability, danger, consequences. Her earlier doubt vanished under the weight of what she thought she was seeing. "Sir," she said sharply to Ethan, "you need to control your dog right now." Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not rush to Rex's side. He remained where he was, grounded, his body language open, his hands visible. "He is controlled," he said calmly. "And he's not the problem." The words barely registered. Fear had already taken the wheel. Michael's vision tunneled. Rex's presence, meant to ground, now overwhelmed him under the weight of everyone else's reactions. He stumbled back a step, bumping into his chair. The canvas bag tipped, knocking lightly against the table leg. The dull thud sounded louder than it should have, and several people recoiled as if it were something explosive. Carol stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her heart pounded, but her voice, when she spoke, remained steady. "Stop," she said, louder than she meant to. "Everyone stop." For a moment, no one listened. Tom's face flushed red. "This is how people get hurt," he snapped. "You bring an animal in here and expect everyone to just trust it." Rex held his ground. His muscles were coiled, but still, his focus locked not on Tom, not on Sarah, but on Michael, who was shaking visibly now. Rex's instincts were clear. This was the edge. Not violence, but panic. And panic, if cornered, could turn into something worse. Ethan felt the room tipping toward a point of no return. Years of experience narrowed his focus. He took one slow step forward, placing himself just behind Rex, close enough that his presence could be felt without crowding. "Michael," he said quietly. The name cut through the noise. Michael froze. His eyes snapped to Ethan, shock and confusion flashing across his face. He had not told anyone his name. The sound of it spoken aloud pulled him back just enough to interrupt the spiral. His breathing stuttered, then slowed a fraction. Ethan did not explain how he knew. He did not need to. "You're okay," he said, voice low and steady. "No one's here to hurt you." The café held its breath. Rex remained still, his body a barrier of calm restraint. Tom faltered, uncertainty creeping into his expression for the first time. Sarah's confidence wavered, her grip on the situation loosening as she realized she might have misjudged the danger entirely. Michael's knees weakened. He reached out blindly, steadying himself against the table. The bag slipped from his grasp and settled fully on the floor with a soft thump. The tension did not break. It peaked. Every eye in the café was fixed on the space between the man, the dog, and the quiet figure standing behind him. The misunderstanding had reached its highest point, balanced on a single breath, and no one knew yet which way it would fall. The room stood suspended in a moment that felt longer than it was, every breath measured, every movement magnified. Fear had reached its peak, and now it waited for instruction, for someone to give it a shape. Ethan understood this space well. It was the space between chaos and control, where a single word spoken the wrong way could undo everything. He took one slow step forward, deliberately placing himself where everyone could see him. His posture remained relaxed, shoulders low, hands open and visible. There was nothing in his stance that suggested command, yet something about the way he stood drew attention naturally, like gravity pulling objects toward its center. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and unhurried, carrying without force. "Everyone take a breath," he said. "Nothing is about to happen." Some did, some did not. But the words softened the edge just enough. Rex responded to the shift immediately. At a subtle signal from Ethan's presence rather than a spoken cue, he lowered himself to the floor, lying lengthwise between Michael and the rest of the café. His body formed a quiet boundary, broad and solid, his head resting between his paws, eyes still alert. It was a posture of restraint, not surrender, designed to slow reactions rather than provoke them. Michael's chest heaved as he struggled to steady himself. His legs trembled, and he let himself sink back into the chair behind him, gripping its edge for support. The canvas bag lay on the floor at his feet now, its worn fabric creased and faded from years of use. It looked ordinary, almost fragile, yet the attention it drew made it feel heavy with imagined danger. Ethan did not approach the bag immediately. He knew better than to rush the object when the real issue was the man attached to it. Instead, he angled his body slightly toward Michael, keeping his distance respectful. "You're safe," he said quietly. "Nobody here wants to hurt you." Michael swallowed hard. His eyes flicked toward the door, then back to Ethan, as if weighing whether trust was worth the risk. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," he murmured, his voice hoarse and strained. "I just needed somewhere quiet." Ethan nodded once, a simple acknowledgement. "I know." Sarah watched the exchange with growing unease. The certainty she had clung to moments earlier had begun to erode, replaced by a creeping awareness that she might have misjudged the situation entirely. Up close, she could see the sweat at Michael's temples, the way his hands shook even as he tried to still them. This did not look like aggression. It looked like someone overwhelmed. Tom shifted uncomfortably near the counter, his earlier confidence draining away. He cleared his throat, but said nothing, suddenly unsure of his footing now that the situation no longer fit the narrative he had built in his head. Ethan crouched slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and predictable. He gestured toward the bag without touching it. "What's in there?" he asked, his tone neutral. "Isn't going to hurt anyone, is it?" Michael hesitated, then shook his head. "No," he said. "It's not. It's not like that." He paused, searching for words. "It's just something I carried, from before." With Michael's nod, Ethan reached out and gently pulled the bag a few inches closer, careful not to startle anyone. He unzipped it part way and looked inside, his expression unchanged. What he saw confirmed what he had already suspected. Nestled among a few personal items was an old marine distress flare, its casing scratched and dulled by time, the ignition mechanism long removed. It was inert, harmless, yet unmistakably military in origin. Ethan closed the bag and looked up. "It's a flare," he said calmly, addressing the room rather than Michael. "An old one? It can't do anything." A ripple of relief moved through the café, uneven but real. Shoulders dropped, breaths released. Someone laughed softly, the sound brittle but genuine. Carol exhaled slowly, her hands unclenching for the first time in minutes. She met Michael's eyes and offered a small, reassuring nod, one human being to another. Rex did not move. He remained where he was, a living divider between misunderstanding and impulse. His presence reminded everyone that restraint had brought them here, not force. Sarah felt heat rise to her face. "I didn't realize," she said quietly, the words heavy with regret. She looked at Ethan, then at Rex, then back at Michael. "I thought I was just trying to keep everyone safe." "You are," Ethan replied gently. "Sometimes safety just looks different than we expect." Michael's shoulders sagged as the tension drained from his body. He wiped a hand across his face, embarrassed and exhausted. "I keep it because it reminds me I made it back," he said softly. "It helps when things get loud." No one interrupted him. The cafe listened. Ethan straightened, taking a small step back to give Michael space. "That makes sense," he said. "A lot of us carry something like that, even if people can't see it." Rex finally shifted, rolling slightly onto one hip, though he stayed on the floor between them. The danger had passed, but his instincts told him to hold the line just a bit longer until the room fully settled. Outside, the sunlight had broken through the last of the fog, casting clean lines across the street. Inside, the atmosphere had changed completely. The tension that once threatened to fracture the room now felt almost fragile in hindsight, as if everyone were aware of how close they had come to making the wrong choice. The misunderstanding had been exposed for what it was, not a threat, but fear layered upon fear. And for the first time since the morning began, the café felt quiet again. The arrival of the police did not come with sirens or shouted commands. It came quietly, announced only by the soft opening of the café door and the presence of two figures who carried themselves with practiced restraint. Officer Daniel Mercer entered first, tall and lean in his early 40s, his uniform neat, but worn in the way of someone who spent more time listening than posturing. Years on the force had given him a calm gaze and a habit of scanning rooms without making people feel hunted. Behind him followed Officer Lena Alvarez, younger, compact, her dark hair pulled back tightly, her eyes sharp and observant. She had grown up around veterans, her father one of them, and it had shaped the way she approached tense situations with patience before pressure. Neither officer placed a hand near their weapon. They paused just inside the doorway, taking in the scene as it was, not as fear might have painted it. Rex lay on the floor between Ethan and Michael, his body relaxed but attentive. Ethan stood a few steps back, his posture open. Michael sat slumped in his chair, exhausted rather than defiant. The café itself felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see whether calm would be respected or shattered. Officer Mercer spoke first, his voice low and steady. "Morning," he said, as if greeting a normal day rather than a room recovering from near panic. "We got a call about a disturbance." Sarah straightened, relief and embarrassment crossing her face in quick succession. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, the words tumbling out faster than usual. "I thought it might be safer to call, just to be sure." Mercer nodded once. "That's okay. Let's just see where we are." He did not approach Michael immediately. Instead, he glanced at Ethan, noting Rex's position with professional interest. "Mind if we talk?" he asked, respectful rather than authoritative. Ethan inclined his head. "Of course." Rex's ears flicked at the sound of new voices, but he did not move. He remained where he was, a quiet anchor in the center of the room. Officer Alvarez noticed him then, her eyes softening slightly. She crouched a few feet away, careful to keep her movements slow and predictable. "Good dog," she murmured, not reaching out, simply acknowledging his presence. Rex met her gaze briefly, then returned his focus to Michael. Mercer approached Michael at an angle rather than head-on, a subtle choice that made the space feel less confrontational. "Sir," he said gently, "how are you holding up right now?" Michael swallowed, his throat dry. "I'm okay," he said, though his voice betrayed fatigue more than confidence. "I didn't mean for this to turn into anything." "I believe you," Mercer replied without hesitation. "Can you tell me what happened from your perspective?" Michael took a moment, gathering himself. He spoke haltingly at first, then with growing clarity as the words found their way out. He explained the noise, the attention, the way his body reacted before his mind could catch up. He spoke of the bag, of the flare, of why he carried it. No one interrupted him. Officer Alvarez listened closely, her expression attentive rather than skeptical. When he finished, she nodded. "Thank you for telling us," she said. "That takes courage." Mercer glanced at the bag on the floor. "Do you mind if we take a look together?" he asked. Michael shook his head. "Go ahead." Ethan stepped slightly aside, giving Mercer clear access without moving Rex. Mercer opened the bag carefully, confirming what Ethan had already seen. He closed it again and set it gently back down. "This isn't a weapon," he said to the room. "There's no threat here." The words seemed to release something collective. Shoulders dropped. A few people exhaled audibly. Tom shifted awkwardly, his earlier bravado replaced by discomfort. He stared at the floor, avoiding eye contact. Sarah's eyes filled with regret. She clasped her hands together, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry," she said, not to the officers, but to Michael. "I didn't understand." Michael nodded once. He did not trust himself to speak yet. Officer Alvarez turned her attention back to Rex. "He's trained," she said, more statement than question. "Yes?" Ethan replied. "He's saved lives by not reacting." She smiled faintly. "Sounds like he did that again today." Rex shifted then, lifting his head and adjusting his position slightly, sensing the room finally settling. He remained between Michael and the rest of the café, but the tension in his body eased, his breathing slow and even. Mercer straightened. "We don't need to take anyone in," he said calmly. "What we do want is to make sure you have support." He looked at Michael. "Are you connected with any veteran services?" Michael hesitated, then shook his head. "I stopped going," he admitted. "Didn't want to be a problem." "You're not a problem," Alvarez said firmly. "You're a person who had a rough morning." She handed him a small card, plain and unassuming. "This is a local group. They meet not far from here. No pressure." Michael took the card, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "Thank you," he said, his voice steadier now. Ethan watched quietly, saying nothing. He knew moments like this did not need commentary. They needed space. Mercer turned back to Sarah. "You did the right thing calling," he said. "Next time, trust what you're seeing, not just what you're afraid of." She nodded, absorbing the lesson. "I will." The officers prepared to leave. No paperwork, no raised voices, no drama. As they reached the door, Alvarez glanced back once more at Rex. "You kept everyone safe," she said softly. Rex's tail thumped once against the floor. When the door closed behind them, the café felt different. Not triumphant, just calmer, as if something fragile had been carried through without breaking. Michael sat quietly, the bag at his feet, the card in his hand. Ethan met his eyes and gave a small nod. Nothing more was needed. The morning resumed, slower now, more aware. Cups were lifted, chairs adjusted. Outside, life moved on, unaware of how close fear had come to choosing violence and how control had gently, firmly taken its place. The café did not return to normal all at once. It eased back into itself in small, careful motions, as if everyone were testing the ground before putting their full weight on it again. Cups were lifted more slowly, voices stayed low, even the espresso machine seemed to hiss with restraint. The officers were gone now, and with them the authority that had steadied the room. What remained was the quieter work of reckoning. Sarah stood behind the counter, hands resting on the polished wood as if she needed the contact to stay grounded. The sharpness that had marked her voice earlier was gone, replaced by something heavier and more difficult to carry. She looked at Ethan, then at Rex, then away again, gathering herself. Sarah had always prided herself on being competent, on anticipating problems before they grew teeth. That habit had kept her employed, promoted, respected. It had also taught her to trust rules more than people. A lesson reinforced the night. A shouting match in this very café had ended with a chair splintered against the wall and her hands shaking for hours afterward. She had promised herself never to let uncertainty run unchecked again. Now she stood in the quiet aftermath, realizing that fear, when given too much authority, could bruise without ever raising a fist. She stepped out from behind the counter and approached Ethan's table, her posture straight but tentative, like someone walking onto ice she did not fully trust. "Sir," she began, then stopped. The word felt inadequate. She tried again. "I'm sorry for how I spoke to you earlier." Her eyes met Ethan's briefly, then dropped. "I was wrong." Ethan listened without interrupting. He had learned long ago that apologies were not improved by commentary. He did not nod, did not smile, did not soften the moment with reassurance. He simply waited, allowing the silence to do its work. Sarah drew a breath and continued, her voice steadier now that the hardest part had begun. I made assumptions. I let my fear speak before I did. She glanced down at Rex, who lay calmly at Ethan's side, his body relaxed now, his eyes half-lidded, but aware. And I disrespected him. Ethan's gaze shifted to Rex, then back to Sarah. If you're going to apologize, he said quietly, it shouldn't be to me. The words landed gently, but their effect was immediate. The café seemed to still entirely, every conversation tapering off, as if drawn into the space around that table. Sarah flushed, the meaning sinking in. She swallowed and took a small step closer, lowering herself slightly, so that she was no longer towering over the dog. I'm sorry, she said again, this time to Rex. The words were simple, stripped of defensiveness. You didn't deserve that. Rex did not move. He did not lift his head or wag his tail. Forgiveness for him was not something that needed demonstration. It existed in the absence of threat, in the return to calm. His breathing remained slow and even, his presence steady. The room held its breath, waiting for a reaction that did not come. Carol watched from her table, her chest tightening with emotion she had not expected. She had lived long enough to know how rare it was for people to apologize without being forced, rarer still to do so publicly. She closed her eyes briefly, thinking of her husband and the many times he had swallowed hurt because it was easier than explaining it. When she opened them again, she saw Sarah still kneeling slightly, eyes fixed on Rex with genuine humility. Michael shifted in his chair, the stiffness in his shoulders easing. He had been quiet since the officers left, unsure of his place now that the crisis had passed. The apology seemed to reach him too, though it was not directed at him. It softened something in his chest, a knot he had carried for so long that he no longer noticed its weight. He looked at Rex with a different expression now, something like gratitude layered with respect. Ethan broke the silence with a small nod. Thank you, he said, not as acceptance, but as acknowledgement. He reached down and rested his hand briefly on Rex's shoulder, a familiar gesture that signaled closure. Rex shifted slightly at the touch, leaning into it for just a moment before settling again. Sarah straightened, exhaling slowly. Please, she said, gesturing toward the counter. Your coffee is on the house. Both of them. She hesitated, then added, Anything you want? Ethan shook his head. Just the coffee's fine. She nodded, grateful for the simplicity of the request. She returned to the counter and poured another cup with care, her movements unhurried. When she placed it on the table, she did so with a quiet respect that had not been there before. Tom lingered near the door, hands shoved into his pockets, his earlier certainty replaced by discomfort. He cleared his throat and looked at Ethan, then at Rex. I shouldn't have said what I did, he muttered, the apology rough and incomplete, but sincere enough to matter. He did not wait for a response before leaving, the bell over the door chiming softly behind him. The cafe began to breathe again. Conversations resumed, cautiously at first, then with growing ease. The tension that had once felt sharp now dulled into reflection, a shared awareness of how quickly fear could distort judgment. People glanced at Rex differently now, not with suspicion, but with curiosity, even respect. Michael stood slowly, testing his balance. He approached Ethan's table, stopping at a respectful distance. Thank you, he said quietly, for stepping in the way you did. Ethan met his gaze. You did most of the work yourself? He replied. You stayed. Michael nodded, accepting that truth with a faint smile. He picked up his bag, slinging it over his shoulder with care. Before turning away, he looked at Rex once more. Good dog, he said softly. Rex opened one eye, then closed it again, Outside, the morning had fully arrived. Sunlight filled the windows, bright and unassuming, casting long shadows across the floor. Inside, the café felt altered, not by drama, but by humility. An apology had been offered. Respect had been restored. No one clapped. No one celebrated. The victory was quiet, and because of that, it felt real. Ethan finished his coffee and stood. Rex rose smoothly beside him, stretching once before settling into his familiar position at Ethan's left. As they moved toward the door, Sarah watched them go, a thoughtful expression on her face. She knew the lesson would stay with her long after the shift ended. The bell chimed again as the door opened, then fell silent as it closed behind them. The café returned to its rhythm, changed in ways that would not show on any receipt or report. And in that quiet change, something important had been learned. Ethan did not look back as he pushed the café door open. He never did. The bell chimed softly above them, the same sound it had made when he and Rex entered earlier that morning, unremarkable and easily forgotten. Cold air brushed against his face, clean and bright now that the fog had fully lifted. Bozeman was awake in earnest, sunlight spilling across the sidewalk and catching in the windows of parked cars, turning an ordinary street into something briefly luminous. Rex stepped outside first, pausing for half a second as if recalibrating to the open space, then settling naturally at Ethan's left side. His gait was smooth again, unburdened, the tension that had tightened his movements inside the café now fully released. To anyone watching, he was simply a well-trained dog leaving a coffee shop with his owner. Nothing more. Nothing that demanded attention. Behind them, through the glass, a few people watched them go. Carol stood near her table, hands folded around her book, her expression thoughtful. She felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, the kind that followed moments where something important had almost been lost and then quietly saved. She knew she would think about this morning later, perhaps when she told her sister about it over the phone, perhaps when she walked past this café again and noticed how it felt different now, even if she could not explain why. Michael lingered near the window, his canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He watched Ethan and Rex disappear down the street, his grip on the strap loosening with every step they took. The card officer Alvarez had given him rested in his jacket pocket, its edges pressing reassuringly against his chest. For the first time in a long while, the noise inside his head had quieted enough for him to hear his own thoughts. He did not feel cured, he did not feel fixed, but he felt seen, and that was more than he had expected when he walked in that morning. Outside, Ethan and Rex moved down the block at an unhurried pace. Ethan's shoulders were relaxed, his stride even, his eyes forward. He did not carry the weight of what had happened behind him as a story to be retold. To him, it was simply a moment handled correctly, one small instance where restraint had done its job. Rex's tail swung gently in rhythm with his steps, his attention wide but easy, scanning the street out of habit rather than necessity. They turned the corner and were gone. Inside the café, the absence they left behind was subtle but undeniable. Conversations resumed fully now, voices regaining their usual volume, laughter returning in small, tentative bursts. The espresso machine hissed and sputtered back into prominence. Cups were refilled. Orders were called out. On the surface, everything looked the same. Sarah stood behind the counter, watching the door long after it had closed. She replayed the morning in her mind, not with the sharp self-criticism she had once perfected, but with a quieter honesty. She thought about the way her fear had narrowed her vision, how easily she had mistaken control for safety. She thought about Rex's stillness, about the way he had absorbed the room's panic without reflecting it back. The lesson sat heavy in her chest, uncomfortable but necessary. She reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small stack of unused signs, plain white with black lettering, the kind meant for hours or temporary notices. For a moment she hesitated, pen hovering above the surface. She was aware of the people watching her now, curious but not intrusive. She could have done nothing. The morning would still pass. No one would challenge her for it. Instead, she wrote carefully, deliberately, letting each word land with intention. Service and rescue dogs are welcome here. She taped the sign to the inside of the front window, smoothing the edges until it sat straight. It was modest, easy to miss if you were not looking for it. That felt right. It was not an apology meant for display, nor a declaration of virtue. It was a reminder, for her, for the staff, for anyone who walked through the door carrying something invisible. When she stepped back, she felt lighter, as if a knot she hadn't known was there had finally loosened. A few customers noticed the sign immediately. One man nodded approvingly. A woman smiled faintly and returned to her drink. Carol saw it and closed her eyes for a brief moment, her lips pressing into a line that might have been a prayer or a thank you. Michael noticed it last, just before he left. He paused, reading the words twice, then touched the glass lightly with 2 fingers before opening the door and stepping out into the sun. The café continued its day, altered in ways that would not show up on any balance sheet or review. The staff moved with a little more awareness. Conversations carried a touch more patience. Nothing dramatic, just a shift. Across town, Ethan and Rex walked on. They did not know about the sign. They did not need to. Rex would likely never lie on that cafe floor again, never feel the particular tension of that room, never meet the eyes of the people who had learned something because of him. That was not how his work measured success. He had done what he was trained to do, what he had always done. He had protected without force, guided without command, held a line long enough for others to see past their fear. Ethan glanced down briefly at Rex, a habit more than a check. Rex met his gaze for a split second, then looked forward again. There was no question there, no need for reassurance. They understood each other completely. The morning stretched ahead of them, full of unremarkable possibilities. Another street, another corner, another quiet day. No one called after them. No one applauded. No one wrote their names down. And yet, in one small cafe in Bozeman, something had changed. Not because of power, not because of authority, but because restraint had been chosen over reaction, respect over assumption. It was not a loud victory. It was not meant to be. It was the kind that lasted. Sometimes the miracle is not loud. Sometimes it does not arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes the miracle looks like restraint when anger would be easier, like patience when fear demands speed, like a quiet man and a faithful dog choosing control over force. In that small cafe, nothing supernatural appeared. No voice from heaven, no visible sign. And yet something holy happened. Fear was stopped without violence. Judgment was softened by understanding. And a room full of strangers walked away, changed. That is how God often works in our daily lives. Not always through dramatic rescue, but through ordinary people who choose mercy. Through moments where we pause instead of react. Through courage that protects rather than harms. The Bible reminds us that blessed are the peacemakers, not the loudest, not the strongest, but those who choose peace when chaos is close. Each of us will face moments like that cafe, at work, at home, in traffic, in conversations where fear wants to speak first. The question is simple. Will we answer with anger or with grace? If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you saw kindness overcome fear in your life. Subscribe to this channel so more stories of quiet courage can reach the people who need them most. And if you believe that God still works through small moments and faithful hearts, write Amen in the comments. May God bless you. May He protect you and those you love. May He give you the strength to choose peace when it matters most. Amen.